All right. On this episode of the Garlic Marketing Show, we're going to talk about finding that inner story that's holding you back. Are you trying to do something brave in the world? I've got Lisa Bloom. Lisa, say hi.
Hello.
Lisa is a storytelling expert, author of The Story Advantage. And we're going to talk about how to find the most common stories that are holding you back. The reason that Lisa thought she was a fake and how she overcame it, how the dissonance, the problem between outer story and inner story is actually probably holding back your outer story and your success, and how to learn how to be vulnerable, and her tips for finding those stories. All this on the Garlic Marketing Show, but of course, it's brought to you by videocasestory.com. One of the best other stories that you need are your customer stories. Go to videocasestory.com to learn how we can help you collect, craft, and deliver those customer stories. Before we get started, it's funny. I gotta tell the story because this is the third time we're talking about this, because we've had the recording fail 3 times. So I'm going to get the best answer ever from Lisa on what keeps people from using story in their business.
Awesome. So third time lucky. Let's hope it works this time. People just don't think they're good storytellers. It astounds me. They feel like, oh, I can't tell a story, as if, the way there are some people who are born joke tellers. They're really, really good at telling jokes. And so people feel like I've got to be born a great storyteller. But the reality is that we're all telling stories all the time. And whatever way we're telling them, we can improve, we can do better. And so part of what I always say to people when they say to me, oh, I can't tell a story, I say, oh, that's an interesting story you're telling. Where's that coming from? Right? So
it's true. It's an inner story preventing the story from happening. And I mean, I see this all of the time, but before we get into, the inner and outer story, tell me a story then of someone who you've helped flip that script, and what did it do for their business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I can actually share my own story, this piece of my own story, I think this is a really good example. So I studied business, I worked in organizations, I worked in learning and development. And at a certain point in time, I discovered storytelling as the thing I've been doing my whole life, but didn't realize. And went then to become a professional storyteller and started training and so on. But I always remember the very first performance. I got up on a stage in front of a huge audience and I told a story and I felt great. Like I felt fantastic and I got a standing ovation. Everything was fantastic. But as I stood there, I suddenly realized that there was a thought in my mind that I'm a total fake. And I had no idea why that was there. And so I thought about it and it took a few days, but then I realized that when I was a kid, my older sister, I remember one night, it was like a Friday night, we were all sitting around after dinner and somebody said, some guest to the family said to her, so what are you going to be when you grow up? And she said, I'm going to be an actress. I'm going to be on stage. And for whatever reason, at that time, I knew that there's only ever one actor and one person on stage in a family, and that was going to be my sister. So here I was, like 25 years later, standing on a stage and feeling like this is where I was supposed to be. This is the work I'm supposed to do. But I had this old story that was still telling me I was a fake. And of course, my sister went nowhere near a stage as she became an adult. She wasn't interested, but this was an inner story that was, preventing me from feeling really secure in this place that I knew actually was the right place for me. And so we have these inner stories all the time. We have these things that happen. As soon as I could release that, then I could really step into this work as a storyteller, and it completely changed the outcomes for me.
And tell me about how you released it, and what was that moment that you realized you released it and things had transformed?
So in this particular situation, it was almost comical that it still existed. Like when I suddenly realized, oh, that's what I'm telling myself, like that's ridiculous, So it was very easy to say, that's just not true. It was so clear. And I was able to let it go. In other cases, it's a little bit more kind of, there's more of a stronghold and it's more there. But there are several ways to look at how do we release an old story. And one of them that I think is one of the most powerful ways is by asking yourself, like, who owns that story? Like, where does that story belong? Because very often we're telling ourselves a story that was never ours in the first place. It was a story that somebody else told about someone else or about us that they had no reason to tell. And it's certainly not true.
Interesting. And I think it's this kind of inception moment, right? That I feel like some of the best people out there, some of the most talented people out there, don't go out and tell their stories, don't go out and promote themselves because they have those stories that are preventing their stories from going out.
Yeah.
And how did you start to develop this into something that you were able to train someone and help them get over? When did you realize that you wanted to help others do this?
Well, I think, I came from this learning and development background where I loved seeing in the classroom that moment where the adult kind of had the sparkle in their eye of this new learning or new understanding. So I was always really fascinated about learning and helping people learn. When I started storytelling, I realized that there's this moment, a good storyteller can hold an audience really captive. I mean, you can hear the proverbial pin drop when a good story is being told. And I started noticing that that's quite similar to a coaching situation where suddenly, people are super engaged, where there's all kinds of possibility. And so I got into this idea of using story as a way to coach people and using story as a way to go deep in the coaching competencies and coaching methodologies. And that's when I got really excited, because I saw how we literally create our reality but through the stories that we tell. And the stories are all made up. Like they're just all made up. There's no true, truth in the story. And yet we call it true and we call it real and we live our lives by them. And we're so attached to our stories, even the ones that do not serve us and do not serve us well. So.
And what do you find are the most common stories that people are attached to that are holding them back?
It's the ones that are, start with I can't or I shouldn't or, you should. It's the ones where we feel that, there's a way of doing something or there's a way of being in the world that's just not accessible to them. And of course, the most common story is the not being good enough story, not tall enough, not short enough, not slim enough, not smart enough. They're very powerful stories that we carry through our lives, and they're the ones that are tough to break through.
And so how did you develop a framework for helping people break through this?
So part of it is using coaching competencies, but taking it to that deeper level around where is story appearing in these moments. And it's kind of ironic that in coach training, when you go to coach school and you learn coach training, one of the things they always say is, don't let people fall into their story. Don't let people get caught up in their story as if the story is going to be some kind of distraction. And I have the opposite approach, which is I think people's stories tell an awful lot about them. And we all tell stories. It's just, something happens, we go tell someone, it becomes a story. It's literally as simple as that. You bump into someone in the street, you have a little accident, you have a conversation that's interesting. The first thing we do, the basic human instinct, is to go tell someone, a friend, a partner, a loved one. And in that telling, we're creating a story, but we don't realize it's a story. So what I noticed was, when I realized that, I noticed that, okay, every coaching opportunity is an opportunity to dig into a story and figure out how we can use it or let go of it or transform it. Or, sometimes the story is really strong and we just have to build on it because it's what brings us, our best relationships and our greatest success. But other times the story really holds us back, and that's where we have to figure out how to manage it and how to work with it.
And can you give me some stories of some of the people that have uncovered this and transformed their business?
So I had a wonderful client who had a long career in an organization. She went in at entry level and, grew through this organization until she was on the board of directors and at a senior kind of executive level. And at a certain point in time, she decided to leave the organization. She'd done some coach training and she wanted to become a coach. And she came to me crippled with anxiety around, but I've never done this before. I can't call myself a coach. I can't go out and market myself as a coach because I'm brand new. And when we dug into just her experience and her history and the story she was telling herself, we realized she'd actually been coaching for most of the 25 years that she'd been in this organization, but she had seen it differently and she called it something different. And when she really began to recognize that actually I've been coaching for a very long time, and people have found me and come to me within the organization for coaching and for advice and for mentorship. She began to build this confidence. And the result was, in the following conversations that she had with prospective clients, she signed them all up, so much so that she had to create a waiting list for her work. It was astounding. And that just changed in an instant as soon as she could see her story and tell her story in a different way.
And when you're uncovering those stories, right, and you're looking for those, do you have a methodology for finding those stories that are really holding you back?
Well, there's a few different approaches. And so, I mean, yes, for sure. I can share one or two of them with you. One is to really notice the words people use. Sometimes we use words that seem quite random, and yet those words, when you hone in, are a really strong guide as to what your true thinking and feeling and the kind of story within the story that exists. So just paying really good attention to the language people use and to the language people use and to the turn of phrase, and sometimes to what they're omitting in the language, not even what they're saying. So that's one way. That's one really clear way of accessing the stories. But another thing is, I find that story exists in our bodies. We really embody story. And so when you begin to tell a story, whether it's a positive one or a negative one, usually there's a physiological impact to it. And so part of what I help people do is really do kind of scanning as they tell stories to see where it lives inside them and to see what kind of sensation it creates within you. And so it's a really interesting way to understand where the story is coming from and what it's doing for you, and whether it's of service or of disservice to you.
It's super interesting because I think a lot of people want this outward technical, like tidbit, but it's true. Our bodies and our subconscious give us so much feedback that we're not paying attention to. And how does that story make you feel, and where do you feel it? It's a really interesting way to bring it back and ground it, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And also, I mean, I think there's a really interesting play that happens around, especially in business. We have a story that we tell out, the outer story. It's our marketing. It's our the way we talk about what we do. It's the kind of impact we have on others. And then there's the story we tell ourselves. And what I've come to see is that if there is no integration between within those two stories, then the result is that the outer story doesn't feel authentic. And authenticity is something that you can't really fake. You can't fake it. Either you feel it or you don't feel it. And so some of the people out there who maybe outwardly look super successful, when you actually watch them tell a story or experience them, especially live, but also online, you'll see that there's a part of you that feels like, I don't quite believe this person. That doesn't quite add up. And usually it's because the inner and outer stories are not integrated. I think it's fascinating.
It is fascinating because, I mean, the original name of our company was Authentic Web, for that authenticity of the stories. And I think people are, it's interesting you're talking about, but people don't pay attention to their inner story. And that's why I'm so happy to have you here. And then they have this outer story, and then they wonder why it's not feeling authentic.
It's not resonating. Yeah.
It's not resonating. And do you find that people often tell a story that they feel they should tell, even if it's not?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I recently I gave a talk, and it was a large audience. It was like 900 people in the audience. And one of the things I spoke about was the fact that I suffer from stage fright, like serious stage fright, and always have. And yet I'm a speaker. I've spoken in like 15 different countries, and it's a big part of my business. And when I talked about how I've struggled with stage fright, and how stage fright has actually been a motivator for me. And it's really helped me, firstly, develop ways to handle it, but also teach it to others and so on. I got an immediate reaction from the audience that they felt like they could just resonate with me in a different way, because I admitted, that I was scared, that I constantly am scared when I'm talking to an audience. And so many people came forward and said, oh, wow, I can so relate to that. And And that kind of showing up where my inner story, which is I'm terrified, I can't do this, they're going to think I'm stupid, and the outer story of actually I love speaking and I hate it, and it's part of who I am and how I show up. It just really resonates for people because it feels real. It's what other people experience, and most people hide it. They're scared to say, yes, I'm scared. I'm scared. They don't want to do it because what will people think?
I have this problem a lot with some of the people that we work with, and we're creating videos of their stories, and I see that where they finally have that moment of authenticity, and they're like, I don't want to share that, and and they're like, I look too weak, or I look too this, or I look too that, and usually that's the moment I'm like, I get goosebumps. I'm like, that's it, and it takes work to get there. So how do you overcome that dissonance between the outer and the inner once you find it and you're like, oh, I don't want to share that, I don't want to look this way or that way? How do you go about overcoming that?
Well, I think a lot of this is about vulnerability and the ability to be a little bit vulnerable and be okay with that. And people assume vulnerability to mean weakness when in fact the opposite is true. But one of the things that I find really reassuring for people is to say to them, I don't need you to tell anything you're not ready to tell. In fact, I don't believe in vulnerability for the sake of vulnerability. And I certainly don't believe that if you're not ready to tell a story that you should. But let's look at why you're not ready to tell the story. So I've had people come to me with amazing stories that they never want to share. And by the time we've done a little bit of story coaching, which is about really kind of teasing out, well, what's in this story? And where is their shame, or where is their discomfort, or where is their empowerment? Suddenly the perspective changes and they feel like they want to tell it. I've had that happen so many times.
And once someone wants to tell that story and that perspective changes, how does that change them?
Well, wanting to tell a story because you feel empowered by it is all very well, but it has to also resonate and be relevant for an audience. So I'm always careful to say, yes, every story should be told. Not every story should be told in a business context, right? So some stories you tell your family, your loved ones, your therapist, right? You don't tell your audience. But if you find a story that truly serves your audience and you feel comfortable telling it, then there are lots of different ways to do so, whether it's, all the different mediums. And I think it's about really coming from a place of service and saying, okay, I've had this experience, or I am this person, and I've had this moment that I want to share. How is it going to empower you as the audience? How is it going to serve you? And if I can honestly see the place that it's of service, then it becomes really easy to tell.
And how do you see that it's a place of service? How do you know that it's a place of service?
Well, first you have to know your audience really, really well. You have to know what resonates for them and what they worry about, what they're concerned about. And sometimes you try it out. You try out stories and see how people respond to them. But I think once you understand what your audience craves, needs, desires, is scared of, then the story that helps them see it's the audience, it's the hero. The story is genuine. That's a story that's very, very powerful.
And so, look, you have a training on how to do this. Tell me a little about the training you have coming up on helping people with their inner stories and finding them and really unblocking them.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this because this is kind of the heart, the core of the work that I do. I help people infuse stories into their businesses, and I help people feel confident with their stories, that with all of their outer stories. But all the techniques in the world and all the expertise you have is useless if you have an inner story that's holding you back. And so this program, it's called Story Power. It helps you identify, define, understand, and transform the inner story so that you're really set up to make the best of all those wonderful techniques and all that amazing expertise you have, because nothing's going to hold you back. So that's why I call it Story Power. And then the second part of the training is for coaches who want to help others to do the same. And so I actually have a story coach certification program where you can learn how to do this and make it part of the business that you offer to others, part of the services you offer to others.
That's fantastic. I think that's a super powerful service to provide, especially if you're doing any type of business consulting. Because so many times it's that, like, no matter how good of a place I've been there and I've helped people, and I'm like, the way to go forward, they just don't do it. And 9 times out of 10, it's because of that story that's holding them back. that I'm not
Yeah,
good enough.
the inner story is one of our biggest saboteurs. And so if you have a reliable, consistent way of being able to identify and transform that story, it's a superpower. It's a superpower that allows you to progress in any direction you want. And it's, you know, and then you get the results with your clients. Then you get the results with the people around you.
Yeah. And so who's ideal for the story power training, identifying those inner stories that are holding you back before they get into certification? Who should be coming to this? What are the signs that I should be coming to this training?
So I think story power is good for anybody who is dealing with, you know, anybody who's doing a brave thing in the world. You know, if they've got a business, if they're out there trying to, you know, offer a program or a service to others, if they're a consultant, if they're a coach, if they're really looking to take action in a big way in their business, then story power is critical for them, because it's going to make them unstoppable. You know, it's going to help them really move forward. I can't you know, I really can't speak enough about how often I see people who have every tactic in the world under their belt. They've done a dozen courses, they've spent tens of thousands of dollars on programs, and they're just not executing, they're not implementing, because their story holds them back. And so this releases all that, and it allows them have access to everything else that they've ever learned. So yeah, I'm so, well, you can hear how excited I am about this.
That's awesome. And we'll put a link to the training as well as a link to your book in the show notes. Lisa, tell me a little bit about your book.
Yeah, so the Story Advantage came out last year. It's all about unleashing the power of story in your business. So it really goes step by step. Where do you find stories? How do you craft stories? Where do you use them in the business? And it's it's available wherever you find books. But we also have a link so that you can, you can download the audio of the book. I was really proud of this book because it's literally like 15 years of my work put together in one place. And of course, it's full of stories, because as a traditional storyteller, I love fairy tales and folk tales. So I infuse them all over the book as well. So it's a really fun read.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to read it. We'll put a link to it in the show notes as well as the training. Well, Lisa, you know, if there's one thing that everyone can do right now to identify that inner story that's holding them back, or to, you know, start to unravel it, what would you tell them to do right this second?
So I think one of the tools that's really, really helpful, and it sounds obvious, but then of course, you know, that's why I'm drawn to story, because it's so simple and it's so accessible to everybody. But it's to identify that moment where either you feel or you think something that is related to a struggle or a conflict, and there's a belief behind it. There's something you believe that would say that you can't do something, or you should do something, or this is not right, or that is not right. And the first step is to just really sit in the awareness of that. What is that belief? What is that one belief you're holding? And then think about, where did that belief come from? What's the source of the belief? And it might be something you've read, it might be something you were told, it might be an experience you had. And, you know, that's the start of really identifying, what is this story that's holding us back? And the one thing I can promise you is that whatever that story is, if it results in struggle and conflict and all those other things, then what I can tell you for sure is that story is not true. And so the question becomes, okay, where did it come from? And how easy is it going to be for me to actually let go of that story? And that's a whole different process. But that's the place to start.
And that's why you have the training, you know. And yeah, these stories have built up in us for so long that they're hard. They take work to work through, to start using, to identify and to invalidate. But I mean, it's a great place to start, because I think a lot of people have these stories holding you back.
Yeah, and I'm a great believer in simple tactics and simple ways of letting, you know, a lot of it is about awareness, and then a lot of it is about taking some simple steps. This isn't about therapy. This isn't about going back to our childhood and trying to figure things out for the next 3 years. This is about taking simple steps to identify and release stories. And it's very powerful and very easy.
I love it. I like powerful and easy.
Aren't we all?
Awesome, Lisa. We'll put a link to all these wonderful things, the training and the book, in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on the Garlic Marketing Show and talking about story, one of my favorite subjects.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for taking Lisa and I on your journey. This has been iGarlic and the Garlic Marketing Show.